Welcome everybody to this Law Talks presentation from the Victorian Law Foundation. Fantastic to have you with us. And we're going to talk in a moment about the Victorian Law Reform Commission, which is a very important body as part of the legal landscape in Victoria and focused on law reform. But before I introduce you to our guest, let me take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be across the great state of Victoria. I'm on Boonwurrung land and eternally grateful for their custodianship over the last 50,000 years or more. And we are privileged to be beneficiaries of that great care and attention they've paid to our lands and waterways. And I acknowledge also that these lands were never ceded. Let me introduce you to the Communications Manager at the Law Reform Commission for Victoria, Nick Gadd. Nick, great to have you with us.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me, Lynn.
Thank you very much indeed for being part of a New Look Law Talks presentations. But let's talk a bit about the spectrum, if you like, of law reform activity in Victoria, because there are various organisations that have a bearing on how laws get scrutinised and reformed. We've got departmental activity, and there are various committees in Parliament, and then there can be royal commissions of various kinds. But the Law Reform Commission is a constant in all of that. So tell us how it fits in that spectrum.
Yes, well, you're right, Lynn. There are a number of bodies and agencies that are involved in law reform. The Law Reform Commission is a permanent body, and it was created by an Act of Parliament, the Victorian Law Reform Commission Act, in 2000. So we're the central agency, if you like. Our sole business is law reform. And the Attorney General of Victoria can ask us to look at any area of law, review it, and make recommendations. And that in a nutshell is our role.
So you're always there, and as you describe yourselves, you are inclusive, independent, and innovative. Why is that important to set out and to sustain as your principles?
Yes, well, to take those in order, inclusive means that we include the views of the community. So we are not just a bunch of lawyers sitting in a room, if you like, and deciding what the law should be. We do a lot of consultations with the community. We ask the community what they think, and there's all kinds of ways that people can contribute. Maybe we'll get to that a bit later, but essentially the point is that when we do make recommendations to the state government about law reform, they are based on including the views of the community. The second of those, independent, is a really important thing because it means that we're not part of the government. We are an independent body that makes recommendations for what we believe will be good law for the community. So we're not party political, we're not biased, and we don't have any special interests influencing us. Our role is simply to make recommendations based on what will benefit the community. And that independence, I think, is what gives us a lot of credibility. And the third thing is being innovative means that often we are making recommendations about laws which do require new solutions. I mean, a lot of the laws that we have, as you know, are old, many centuries old in some cases, and they need to be updated to be in step with community values and attitudes and technology and all of those things. So, for example, we've just completed a review of Contempt of Court laws. And those laws, of course, they relate to what people are allowed to say, for example, about court cases. Now, of course, that has changed a lot in the age of Facebook and the internet and instant digital communication. So the question is, are those laws still fit for purpose in the present day? And so we have to come up with new solutions to old problems, if you like. And so that's why those things, inclusive, independent, and innovative, are all really important.
I'd love to talk to you now about what steps you take in the work, how you do it. And you talked a little bit about the consultation process, and we'll pick up on that. But in the first instance, Nick, how do you pick what to look at?
Yeah, well, there's basically two ways. So the main way is that the Attorney General can ask us to look at an area of law. And that's actually set out in the Act, which I mentioned before. So the Attorney General can ask us to review any law, any area. It could be civil law, criminal law, it could be any area of law. And the kind of things that we look at are really diverse. You know, everything from something like laws of abortion to you know, commercial law to criminal law, how victims are treated. It can be anything. And so the Attorney General then can say to the VLRC, okay, I want you to look at this area of law, take 12 months or 15 months, however long it is, review it, come back with some recommendations for the government to consider. So that probably is about how 80% of our inquiries are initiated. They come from the Attorney General. The other 20% are ones that we initiate ourselves, and they are called community law reform projects. And the Act, again, says that we have the capacity to do that, to choose what are called relatively minor legal issues of general community concern, and we can initiate our own inquiries into those.
So what sort of things come up in community?
A whole lot of things, actually, and we do invite the community to make proposals about what they think we should be looking at, and we have certain criteria. It must be a Victorian law, of course. It can't be something that is a really big issue which is going to require major overhaul of the legal system. It has to be something that's relatively manageable and contained, isn't going to use a whole lot of our resources, because we only have a small team of 2 or 3 people who can work on community projects, but it must influence, it must have an effect on a lot of people's lives. So for example, we've done reviews on the laws relating to how you get a birth certificate in Victoria. Okay, there's certain problems with birth certificates, which we looked at a number of years ago and made some recommendations. Now that is something that's that affects everybody. Of course, everybody must have a birth certificate. But as a legal issue, it was fairly manageable. It only required a number of small changes to the law to make it better. Other things that we've looked at in the community law reform program have included the law of funeral and burial instructions. And another one was to do with the laws about about tenants' rights, and when it's okay for landlords to enter a property and take photographs of tenants' belongings if they are advertising the property, for example. So there's often these kind of quite small, quite specific things. Another one we've just completed is about neighbourhood tree disputes, which is about what happens when neighbours argue about a tree in the garden. You know, if my neighbour's got a big tree and I think it might be dropping branches into my garden, or onto my family, or the roots are causing some damage, that's the kind of issue which affects a lot of people. We don't have any laws, any acts of parliament that deal with that issue. So we looked at that and made some recommendations, which could, make life better for a lot of people. But again, it's a fairly contained and manageable kind of issue.
Yes, but yeah, really vital. I mean, all those areas that you've listed have huge impact on ordinary people and how we go about our business, from birth certificates to trees. But do you undertake both the reviews that you're asked to do by the attorney and the community consultations in the same sort of way? Or can you just step us through how you go about doing a review?
Yes, sure. So, and the answer is yes. I mean, we do have a pretty standard process that we follow. And I mean, it begins when there's a problem has been identified in the law. We get the reference either from the Attorney General or we initiate one ourselves. And we do a lot of research. So we have teams of researchers who work on each project, and they will look at the law as it is. They'll look at laws in other states and other countries to compare how other jurisdictions are dealing with these issues. And we'll look at how many people are affected by a particular law. We'll try to scope out what the problems are. Then there'll be a stage of, we might get an expert panel to come in and assist us. For example, if we're looking at something like crime and mental impairment, which we looked at a number of years ago, well, we needed to get some advice from people like psychiatrists, psychologists, and mental health professionals to give us some advice about those matters, because the commissioners are all people with a legal background. They don't have a health background. So we do sometimes need to have experts to advise us about the issue. Now, those people don't make the recommendations, but they will give us, they'll make sure that we're up to speed on what we need to know. Then there's a stage of consultations, which is really important because of our commitment to being inclusive. And when we do that, we put a lot of effort into going around Victoria and speaking to people. And anybody can speak to us. Of course, we'll always consult with particular peak bodies, people who are affected by a particular law. And we do a lot of that. We spend months just talking to people and hearing what they think and what they think the law should be, what problems they've had. And then we invite submissions. We publish something called a consultation paper, which is a document that sets out the law as it is, asks a number of questions, and invites people to respond with their views by making submissions. And people can make submissions in writing, or they can complete a form on the website, or they can just talk to it. There's lots of ways of making a submission. And all of that, so the research, the consultations, the expert panel, and the submissions, we use all of that in our commissioners, and there are 8 of those at the minute. They will consider all of these things and then come up with some recommendations for how the law could be improved. And we will then put that into a report, setting out all of our reasoning, all of the evidence, and mentioning who we've spoken to, and then we will give that report to the Attorney General. And the Attorney General then, it's up to them essentially to present it to Parliament, and the government then to decide what happens next. Because one important thing I should say is that, of course, the VLRC does not have the power to change the law itself. That's up to Parliament to do that. What we do is we make recommendations. And so once we've handed the report over to the Attorney General, it's then out of our hands and our work is done at that point.
It sounds like quite a long process.
Oh, it can be, yeah. And it often takes more than a year from go to woe. When we are given an inquiry by the Attorney General, then she will give us a due date by which time we must report. Generally, that's about 12 months or 15 months, sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes up to 18 months. It can vary depending on the size and scope of the project.
So when you hand it over, you make recommendations about how you think the law should be improved. And as you said, you can't do any more than that. That's the end of your responsibility. So how do you determine whether or not you've been successful? What do you want to happen? I mean, clearly your recommendations are made in good faith and you'd like the government to implement them. Do they? And
well, usually they do. About 70 or 80% of the time, we find that our recommendations do get implemented. Sometimes when we complete a report and give it to the Attorney General, sometimes even at that point, the Attorney General will commit the government to implementing the recommendations. That happened, for example, with the pre-disputes report that I just mentioned before. When she launched the report, the Attorney General committed the government to implementing it. Now, of course, these things don't happen overnight. It takes a long time for legislation to get through Parliament sometimes. So it can be a number of years between us delivering our recommendations and the law actually changing. But yes, we do consider it a sign of our success, I suppose, that our recommendations do usually get implemented. It doesn't happen 100% of the time, but maybe that's a good thing too, because as I mentioned before, we're an independent body. Our job is not to simply tell the government what it wants to hear, what its platform happens to be. Our recommendations are independent. But I think it's a sign of the credibility of the Commission that governments of all political colours over the years have implemented VLRC recommendations.
You've done, what, over 40 odd inquiries into various aspects of Victorian law. Yeah. Are there some standouts for you in terms of the scrutiny that you've had, the recommendations you've made, and the impact that's had?
There have been some really interesting ones. I mean, it was the VLRC that recommended the decriminalisation of abortion in 2008, I think, which was a major change. Another important one was the legalization of medicinal cannabis, which took place in 2015. So that was a VLRC recommendation. That had a big impact actually on the law across the whole of Australia, because Victoria was the first state to legalise medicinal cannabis. And after that, other states followed suit, and then at the national level, medicinal cannabis was decriminalised. So it was legalised. So we can say that that was a really influential report. But there have been many. And there's a number even before the Parliament now relating to things like crimes and mental impairment, which would be quite significant if they did pass.
So if you're doing legal studies now and you need to look closely at some of the VLRC work, are there a couple of examples that you would point people to?
Yeah, well, I think for VCE, students have to look at recent examples within the last 4 years. And one that I would recommend students look at is to do with the victims of crime in the criminal trial process, which was a review that we completed in 2016. And that was a really wide-ranging review of the way that victims of crime are treated once a crime is actually prosecuted and a person is charged and goes to court. And we were asked to look at every step in that process and make recommendations about how to make it better for victims, less traumatic. And the recommendations that we made there were quite important and influential, and have actually most of them been implemented subsequently by the government. So it's a good one for students to look at. I think it also relates a lot to the criminal procedure and what happens in courts. The recommendations that we ended up making with regard to that victims of crime inquiry were to do with things like improving victim impact statements, improving the amount of information and support that victims are given, making it a bit less traumatic when victims have to give evidence in court, because that can be an extremely traumatic process when people have to essentially relive an experience under cross-examination. So we made some recommendations about changing the laws of cross-examination. And other things like allowing a witness to have an intermediary to assist them. If the person is a young victim, a child victim, or somebody with a cognitive impairment, they should have an intermediary to assist them. So we made a lot of quite wide-ranging and significant recommendations there, and most of them have now been implemented, which will make life a bit easier for victims of crime in the criminal trial process.
I bet some of the consultation with victims and support organisations for that inquiry were pretty challenging. They must have given you some pretty tough stories about the experience of working the way through the legal process as a victim. Yeah, they certainly did. And this was one where it was really important, of course, that we did extensive consultations with victims of crime and with their families as well as with people in the legal profession, defence and prosecution lawyers and the courts. And a lot of the time, victims told us that they did not feel they were included in the process at all, because, of course, the criminal trial is basically set up as adversarial conflict between the prosecution and the defence, and the purpose is to decide if the accused person is guilty or not. So it's all focusing on the accused person in court. It's not really, traditionally, it hasn't really been about the victim at all. So victims often told us that they felt excluded. They felt they were not informed, for example, about things like what the person was going to be charged with. If the charges were changed or later dropped, they might not be informed about that. Then if it did go to trial and they ended up being cross-examined, they felt that they were being re-traumatized by the cross-examination. It's something that happened quite often. And some people told us that the experience of going through the justice system was as bad or even worse than the initial crime itself, which is a terrible indictment, really, of the process. So we certainly did hear some really awful
stories, and we tried to make recommendations that would make things a bit better.
Mm. Well, great work. Let's circle back a bit, because at the beginning we talked about all the other organisations and various committees and bodies that are involved with law reform. And I know that in the VCE curriculum there is a requirement to compare, if you like, the influence of one over the other. Can you give us a sense of how the VLRC's work would compare, for example, with a Royal Commission or a committee?
Yeah, I mean, there are many differences, and all of those bodies are influential. The differences are, I think, a number of them are to do with the way they're set up and to do with the way that they work. So if you take a parliamentary committee, for example, that is made up of members of parliament, which considers a particular issue and then makes recommendations back to the parliament. Now, they, of course, are MPs, they are politically aligned. So that's quite different to the VLRC, which is made up of independent commissioners who have no political alignment. And a parliamentary committee will only last for the length of the parliament as well. Whereas the VLRC is a permanent body. Parliament stops and it makes no difference to us. We continue with our work, even if the government changes. It makes no difference to us. We will continue and we will still report back. And the VLRC has been going for 20 years. And again, in contrast with a Royal Commission, the Royal Commission is generally constituted to look at one specific issue, such as, we have one at the moment, in the mental health one, and also the police informers one, which has taken place in Victoria. They're looking at a specific issue, and when their work is done on that, that commission will cease to exist. Whereas the VLRC, of course, will just continue to take on other projects. There are other differences too, to do with the ways that evidence is gathered. I mean, a Royal Commission can subpoena evidence, it can compel witnesses to appear, whereas we don't have those kind of powers. So our consultations are more informal, if you like.
Nick, that's very interesting. And I think, as you say, there are horses for courses in terms of the way in which laws are reviewed, and that we work constantly to improve the way in which the legal framework in Victoria and Australia more widely responds to our needs. And I thought your example earlier about whether or not contempt of court was still relevant, the old law, given the massive changes in communication. So that would be a really interesting one to look into as well.
Look, I do think that would be a good thing for students to look at, the Contempt of Court report, which was tabled in Parliament just a couple of weeks ago. So that's really new. Students and teachers can find all of these reports on our website. So just look for Victorian Law Reform Commission and you'll find our website, and all of our reports, all of our published reports are there. All of the consultation papers are there, and all the submissions are there as well, unless they're confidential. So everything that you need to know to look into a specific inquiry is there. And Contempt of Court is certainly a good one. You just do need to bear in mind, be careful about the difference between a recommendation and an actual legal change. Because what we do is we make recommendations, and then it's up to the government to introduce a bill to Parliament, and up to Parliament to enact that bill. So there's no legal change until Parliament has actually made that change. So it's important to be aware of that distinction. Yes,
but you're a really critical link in that chain in terms of making sure that our laws are fit for purpose. Anything else you'd like to add, Nick, about the work of the VLRC?
Well, I would say that on our website, there's also some other resources that would be useful. We have, there's this booklet. Actually, I think this one. Yeah, this is our latest booklet, which is the Law Reform Commission, Law Reform in Action, it's called. And this has got some case studies in it, and it's got a bit more detailed information about the work of the VLRC, and you'll find that useful. We can send out class sets of these to anybody who requests them. It's all free. You just need to send us an email. You can join our mailing list as well, and you can email us with questions, and we'll be happy to respond.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I'm really impressed that the VLRC is making such an effort to add transparency, I think, to its principles, independence, inclusiveness, innovation, and making sure that everybody is aware of what you do and how you do it and what becomes of your recommendations afterwards. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you, Lynn. It's been a pleasure.
Nick Gadd is the Communications Manager at the Victorian Law Reform Commission. And as he said, all their materials are available online, and that booklet, which looks terrific, is available to you for delivery. You don't even have to buy it. So thanks again for joining us for this edition of the Law Talk series. Great to see you. I'm Lynn Holtain from the Victoria Law Foundation. We'll talk again soon.